Assalamualaikum dan selamat sejahtera. Anda bersama saya Nabilah Khaleeda dalam Meniaga AWANI, dan kita akan mulakan dengan perkembangan terbaru di mana Tun Daim Zainuddin akan didakwa di Mahkamah Session Kuala Lumpur hari ini berhubung tuduhan gagal mematuhi notis dengan tidak mengisytiharkan harta. Perincian lanjut kita bersama wartawan Firdaus Azil di perkarangan Kompleks Mahkamah Kuala Lumpur. Firdaus, apa perkembangan terkini di sana? Silakan.
Okey, baik, terima kasih Nabilah. Di Bukit Jalil seperti yang dimaklumkan, mungkin saya boleh kongsikan bahawa bekas Menteri Kewangan itu tiba di Kompleks Mahkamah Kuala Lumpur Jalan Duta kira-kira pukul 8.45 pagi tadi, ditemani oleh isteri beliau, Tumpuan Abdul Khalid, yang mana seperti dilaporkan media sebelum ini, ketika ini kalau mengikut sistem kehakiman, bekas Menteri Kewangan itu sedang menghadapi pertuduhan di Mahkamah Magistrate di hadapan Hakim Azura Alwi berhubung dengan tuduhan gagal mematuhi notis dengan tidak mengisytiharkan harta, yang mana pendakwaan itu dilakukan di bawah Seksyen 36/2 iaitu Akta Suruhanjaya Pencegahan Rasuah Malaysia 2009 berkaitan dengan kesalahan berkaitan dengan pendedahan aset. Dan kita, kalau boleh juga saya nak kongsikan sebelum saya nak memperincikan sedikit tentang kes ini, kita rakan-rakan media, kalau anda dapat lihat, sudah berkumpul di sini pukul 7 pagi tadi, dan di sebelah sana itu ada sedang menanti sekiranya selesai pertuduhan, berkemungkinan besar mungkin akan ada sidang media seperti yang dilakukan kelaziman sebelum ini. Dan juga saya nak kongsikan bahawa bekas Menteri Kewangan itu diwakili oleh bekas ataupun mantan Peguam Negara Tan Sri Tommy Thomas, yang mana pada awal bulan ini, pada 11 Januari lepas, beliau dan keluarganya telah memfailkan permohonan untuk mencabar permohonan berkenaan siasatan kehakiman, iaitu antaranya selain pada Daim sendiri, iaitu Tumpuan Naimah serta 4 orang anak mereka, Asnida, Mat Wiradani, Muhammad Amin Zainuddin, Muhammad Amin Zainuddin berserta dengan Ilham Tower Sendirian Bahad, yang telah memfailkan permohonan itu pada 10 Januari lepas dan telah menamakan SPRM serta pendakwa raya sebagai responden, yang mana di dalam antara sedikit hujah Tan Sri Thomas bahawa ini adalah berkaitan tentang pendedahan Tun Daim Zainuddin yang disebarkan ataupun didedahkan melalui Pandora Papers, dan Tan Sri Tommy Thomas berkata bahawa SPRM hanya merakam keterangan Daim setahun setengah selepas kertas Pandora dikeluarkan, hanya pada Jun 2023, 2 tahun selepas itu baru SPRM mula mempergiatkan. Ini adalah hujah Tan Sri Thomas, iaitu hanya 2 tahun selepas itu, pada Jun 2023, SPRM mula mempergiat tindakan terhadap Daim dan membekukan aset keluarganya. Dan juga beliau mendakwa ataupun hujah beliau, SPRM secara tidak sah telah membekukan akaun anak guamnya sejak 7 Jun 2023, menyerbu dan menyita bangunan Menara Ilham setinggi 60 tingkat pada 18 Disember serta menggeledah kediaman Daim sebelum ini, serta menyita 11 kenderaan pada 3 Januari lepas, yang mana beliau berkata sekiranya siasatan ataupun dakwaan ini teruskan, Daim akan diprejudiskan. Dan katanya lagi, antara hujahnya ialah anak guam saya kini berusia 85 tahun dan berharap untuk beliau mengingati perkara yang berlaku dalam 25 ke 30 tahun lepas adalah sesuatu yang mustahil. Tetapi juga saya nak kongsikan sebelum saya menutup lintas langsung ini ialah pada 27 Januari, kalau boleh kita ingat kembali, Tan Sri Tun Daim Zainuddin telah mengeluarkan kenyataan media yang mana beliau berkata MACC officer telah merakamkan kenyataan pada saya. Peguam saya dimaklumkan bahawa saya akan didakwa pada 29 Januari berkenaan tentang Seksyen 36/2, dan so be it, I look forward to my day in court. Itu yang kenyataan dikeluarkan oleh Tun Daim Zainuddin. Buat masa ini kita akan terus menantikan di sini, kita akan mendengar sekiranya kita boleh mendapat fakta pertuduhan dan sebagainya, dan juga sekiranya akan ada sidang media yang dilakukan sama ada oleh beliau ataupun peguam yang mewakili beliau sendiri. Jadi buat masa ini, Nabilah, itu saja saya kira lintas langsung dari Kompleks Mahkamah Kuala Lumpur Jalan Duta. Kembali pada Nabilah.
Baik, terima kasih Firdaus Azil, dan Firdaus akan terus bawakan perkembangan dakwaan Tun Daim Zainuddin di Kompleks Mahkamah Kuala Lumpur dalam buletin AWANI seterusnya, dan saya akan teruskan dengan perkembangan lain. Ahli-ahli politik perlu menerima kenyataan selepas ini mereka juga tidak mempunyai pencen. Perdana Menteri Datuk Seri Anwar Ibrahim berkata ia termasuk mereka yang bakal menjadi calon untuk bertanding di mana-mana kerusi pada pilihan raya akan datang. Bagaimanapun, perkara itu akan dibincangkan secara lebih teliti dalam jawatan kuasa persaraan sebelum diluluskan Kabinet.
Maknanya yang akan menjadi calon dalam pilihan raya akan datang harus terima kenyataan bahawa skim mereka tidak termasuk pencen. Kalau dengan sebab ini tidak setuju jadi calon, baik. Jadi senang kerja saudara Syarani. Ya, itu pilihan kita. Ya. Tapi seperti biasa dalam sistem kita akan bincang cara lebih teliti dalam jawatankuasa persaraan dan kemudian dalam kabinet.
Anwar berkata sistem pencen berkenaan juga tidak lagi diamalkan oleh sebahagian negara-negara maju. Selain itu, kerajaan menyangkal dakwaan langkah mewujudkan pengambilan baru penjawat awam secara tetap tetapi tidak berpencen akan menjejaskan nasib orang Melayu yang merupakan majoriti dalam penjawat awam. Langkah itu sebaliknya telah dikaji sejak lama dulu di mana mesti ada rancangan baru untuk menggantikan skim itu bagi mengelakkan negara daripada risiko muflis dan memberi masalah kepada generasi akan datang. Pada Rabu lalu, Timbalan Perdana Menteri Datuk Seri Ahmad Zaid Hamidi berkata pengambilan penjawat awam baru secara kontrak dilakukan untuk tempoh singkat sebelum Kabinet meluluskan dasar pengambilan baru secara tetap tetapi tidak berpencen.
Baik, seterusnya kami akan bersama dengan pakar ekonomi Dr. Muhammad Afzani Zamdul Rashid, Ketua Ekonomi Bank Muamalah Malaysia Berhad untuk kita berbincang mengenai mesyuarat FOMC yang akan diadakan pada esok 30 dan juga 31 Januari. Jadi selamat pagi Doktor.
Selamat pagi.
Baik, mungkin boleh Doktor kongsikan kalau dalam ramai penganalisis menjangkakan The Fed akhirnya akan menurunkan kadar dananya pada mesyuarat minggu ini. Jadi adakah data ekonomi di Amerika akan menyokong jangkaan ini? Pada pendapat Doktor bagaimana?
Okey, kalau saya lihat bacaan yang dibuat oleh pihak Bloomberg, rata-ratanya para penganalisis ekonomi meletakkan bahawa Fed Funds Rate ini akan dikekalkan pada paras 5.5%. Itu saya kira memang dah orang kata tu price in oleh pasar kewangan. Namun yang menjadi persoalan sekarang, bilakah pihak Fed akan mula menurunkan kadar faedah mereka, dan sebelum ini banyak cakap-cakap yang menjangkakan penurunan kadar faedah ini akan bermula seawal bulan Mac yang lalu. Namun apabila keluarnya data berkenaan dengan pasaran buruh, kemudian minit mesyuarat FOMC menunjukkan bahawa pihak Fed dilihat cenderung untuk menurunkan kadar faedah pada hujung tahun 2024, maka itu banyak mengubah tentang persepsi dari segi timing bilakah Fed Fund Rate akan diturunkan. Jadi saya kira mesyuarat pada minggu ini, fokus yang diberikan oleh pihak pasar kewangan adalah untuk melihat naratif yang akan dibawa oleh pihak Federal Reserve, mengambil kira tentang data yang terkini, terutamanya dari segi data suku keempat KDNK Amerika Syarikat yang menunjukkan peningkatan sebanyak 3.3% pada suku keempat yang melebihi jangkaan lah. Jadi adakah mereka akan orang kata tu mengambil pendirian yang lebih hawkish ataupun sebaliknya, itu yang akan menjadi tumpuan lah pada mesyuarat pada minggu ini.
Jadi pada pandangan doktor sendiri, adakah akan berlaku penurunan juga tahun ini dan berapakah jangkaan ataupun kadar jangkaan itu sendiri?
Sebenarnya jangkaan penurunan kadar faedah itu telah pun termaktub dalam unjuran yang dibuat oleh pihak Federal Reserve. Jadi maksudnya ini bukanlah suatu persepsi yang dibuat oleh pasaran. Jadi ini merupakan satu dokumen yang rasmi yang telah dikeluarkan oleh pihak Federal Reserve. Cuma kuantum yang ditunjukkan oleh pihak Federal Reserve bahawa penurunan itu akan berlaku sekitar 75 asas bagi tahun 2024. Namun pasaran kewangan menjangkakan penurunan yang lebih daripada 75 asas. Jadi itu menimbulkan kekilafan lah antara pasaran dan apa yang tadi dikongsi oleh pihak Federal Reserve. Jadi itu saya kira merupakan faktor utama kenapa pasaran kewangan menjadi agak meruap ataupun volatile, terutamanya dalam pasar mata wang lah, kerana kebiasaannya apabila jangkaan dasar monetary yang restriktif ataupun ketat dan sebagainya, itu akan memberi sokongan kepada nilai dolar. Jadi sekali lagi soal timing ataupun pemaksaan bila penurunan kadar faedah itu berlaku, itu yang akan banyak menentukan hala tuju sentimen, terutamanya sentimen dalam pasar mata wang yang saya nampak pada masa sekarang ni.
Doktor, apa pula jangkaan reaksi bank pusat di negara ini dan membangun dan juga di Malaysia sendiri di bawah Bank Negara Malaysia? Apa jangkaan mereka? Okey,
rata-ratanya saya melihat dasar monetary yang dibuat oleh pihak Amerika Syarikat ini dianggap sebagai trend setter lah bagi dasar monetary peringkat global, termasuk di rantau Asia dan juga tidak terkecuali jugalah bagi Malaysia. Namun considerationnya akan masih lagi kata tu berkenaan tentang perkembangan ekonomi domestik masing-masing. Namun kalau kita lihat beberapa jangkaan yang dibuat oleh pihak ataupun bank pelaburan utama di dunia menjatuhkan kalau di rantau Asia ni mungkin antara yang terawal akan mengikut jejak langkah pihak Federal Reserve adalah di Indonesia dan juga Filipina. Dan bagi di Malaysia pula rata-rata para penganalisis ekonomi meletakkan bahawa kadar dasar semalaman ini akan kekal berada di paras 3% untuk tahun 2024. Walau bagaimanapun bagi saya perkara ini begitu dinamik dan kita akan melihat apakah yang akan bakal berlaku kepada ekonomi global sekiranya jangkaan kelembapan ekonomi global itu melebihi daripada jangkaan, sudah pasti ia memerlukan suatu bentuk campur tangan yang sewajarnya lah oleh Bank Pusat di peringkat rantau Asia dan termasuk juga di Malaysia.
Dan kalau boleh saya petik sedikit kata-kata dari pakar ekonomi Profesor Dr. Adam Paulson, beliau menekankan bahawa ancaman dunia untuk beberapa tahun mendatang adalah kadar faedah yang terlalu tinggi dan ini akan turut membabaikan khususnya negara membangun. Dan sekiranya The Fed menurunkan kadar faedah bermula minggu ini, adakah suhu ancaman ini akan berkurangan atau bagaimana?
Betul, saya sebenarnya memang bersetuju dengan kaitan beliau kerana kadar faedah terutamanya di negara maju seperti di Amerika Syarikat, di UK, di European Union sebenarnya dalam trajektori yang begitu tinggi dan sebenarnya kalau kita lihat kadar faedah ni amat penting juga ya untuk menggalakkan aktiviti pelaburan dan kita pun sedang berhadapan dalam suasana peralihan ekonomi seperti renewable energy atau tenaga boleh diperbarui, kenderaan elektrik dan sebagainya sudah pasti memerlukan suatu bentuk pelaburan yang besar. Maka saya melihat sebenarnya ada peranan dasar monetary untuk menggalakkan pertumbuhan ataupun menggalakkan pelaburan dalam sektor-sektor tersebut. Jadi terdapat pada pengamatan saya lah terdapat justifikasi bahawa dasar monetary itu perlu dilonggarkan untuk kita menggalakkan usaha untuk menggalakkan pelaburan dalam sektor-sektor yang disebutkan tadi. Jadi kalau kadar faedah itu kekal tinggi, sudah pasti ia akan memberikan suatu disinsentif lah kepada sektor swasta untuk menggalakkan aktiviti pelaburan mereka. Jadi mungkin itu satu sisi yang boleh kita lihat kenapa terdapatnya keperluan untuk mengurangkan kadar faedah.
Baik, itu sedikit perkongsian daripada pakar ekonomi kita Dr. Muhammad Azlan Nizam Abdul Rashid, Ketua Ekonomi tentang jangkaan untuk mesyuarat FOMC pada 30 dan juga 31 Januari 2024. Jadi sekian untuk perkongsian daripada Dr. Nizam. Kita akan berhenti rehat seketika, kembali selepas ini.
Di sini kebenaran menjadi nyata.
Menjadi bayangan masa depan.
Konspirasi adalah permainan duniawi.
Di sini, identiti baru terjadi.
Bila kecantikan membawa risiko.
I'm not a product. I am a freaking human being.
Dan ID adalah segalanya.
Bila mana rahsia mencerminkan kita?
Jika kita benar-benar percaya.
Hanya masa menentukannya.
Inilah cerita untuk anda sekeluarga. Inilah Home of Originals. Hanya di Astro.
Dua beradik bawah umur dipercayai dieksploitasi ibu mereka telah pun diselamatkan oleh pihak JKM iaitu Jabatan Kebajikan Masyarakat.
Yang di-Pertuan Agong bertitah bahawa Istana Negara tidak akan terlibat dalam sembarang percaturan politik.
KPM belum putuskan bila pelajar perlu pakai semula seragam sekolah. Pemakaian sedia ada diteruskan sehingga ia diputuskan kelak.
Dua anggota polis ditahan kerja sehinggalah siasatan kes samun dan rogol.
Gelombang keempat monsun timur laut kini beralih ke selatan tanah air dengan keadaan banjir di Johor semakin meningkat.
Ekonomi Malaysia dijangka berkembang 4.5% pada 2024 dan 4.6% pada tahun hadapan.
Seorang pelajar tingkatan 5 diculik sebelum dikurung, bekas teman lelakinya dikepung.
Tiada laporan rakyat Malaysia terjejas dalam tragedi pengeboman di Kerman Cemetery.
Bertemu kembali dalam Niaga Awani, ringgit dijangka didagangkan sekitar Julai 4.72 hingga 4.73 minggu ini dengan penurunan terhad memandangkan mata wang tempatan secara teknikalnya berada dalam keadaan terlebih jual, kata penganalisis. Ketua Ahli Ekonomi Bank Muamalat Malaysia Berhad Dr. Muhammad Afzal Nizam Abdul Rashid berkata, pelabur memberi tumpuan kepada data Amerika Syarikat yang akan dikeluarkan dalam masa terdekat, terutama pembayaran gaji bukan ladang bagi Januari. Dan saya akan kongsikan
data NFP dijangka turun kepada 162,000 pekerjaan daripada 216,000 pekerjaan pada Disember lepas. Beliau berkata perkara lebih penting adalah mesyuarat jawatankuasa pasaran terbuka Rizab Persekutuan Amerika Syarikat FOMC yang dijadualkan pada 30 hingga 31 Januari ini dengan kebanyakan ahli ekonomi menjangkakan Fed mengekalkan status quo. Katanya berdasarkan niaga hadapan kadar faedah, penurunan kadar faedah pertama pada Mac telah berkurangan daripada 73.6% pada 11 Januari 2024 kepada 50.4% pada masa ini yang boleh memberikan sokongan kepada dolar Amerika. Sementara itu, pengarah urusan SPI Asset Management Stephen Ines berkata, sidang akhbar pasca FOMC pada 31 Januari ini boleh memberi kesan terhadap jangkaan pasaran mengenai pengurangan kadar faedah bagi suku pertama. Ujarnya, walaupun mungkin berlaku turun naik, melainkan tercetus peningkatan ketegangan geopolitik Amerika-China, ringgit dijangka tidak mengalami penurunan ketara daripada paras semasa, terutama apabila beberapa pengurangan kadar faedah Amerika telah diambil kira bagi 2024. Bagaimanapun, menjelang laporan pekerjaan dan indeks harga pengguna IHP Amerika untuk Januari yang akan dikeluarkan pada awal Februari ini, turun naik ketara pasaran mungkin berterusan dan pergerakan meningkat ringgit yang ketara adalah mustahil sehingga pelaporan berisiko tinggi ini berlalu. Bagi dagangan yang baru berakhir minggu lalu, mata wang tempatan didagangkan bercampur-campur ekoran sentimen prospek ekonomi global termasuk China dan Amerika Syarikat selain pengurangan kadar faedah yang tidak pasti. Pada Rabu, Jawatankuasa Dasar Monetary MPC Bank Negara Malaysia BNM mengekalkan kadar dasar semalaman OPR pada 3% menerusi mesyuarat pertama bagi 2024, menandakan mesyuarat MPC keempat berturut-turut memutuskan kadar utama dikekalkan tidak berubah. Berasaskan Jumaat ke Jumaat, ringgit diniagakan rendah berbanding dolar Amerika pada 4.7275 daripada 4.7160 pada minggu lepas. Unit domestik juga didagangkan rendah berbanding beberapa mata wang utama lain.
Baik, pada ketika ini saya akan kongsikan pergerakan ringgit untuk setakat dalam jangka masa 1 tahun. Tapi untuk hari ini saya akan kongsikan pada setakat jam 9.21 pagi, ia berada paras 4.73 dan angka ini merupakan menunjukkan pergerakan ringgit itu menyusut. Kalau anda boleh lihat trend ini menunjukkan graf ini menaik dan bila graf ini menaik, ringgit itu menyusut berbanding dolar Amerika. Kalau anda dapat lihat pada sekitar sebelum mula Mac lebih kurang pada Februari tahun lalu, ini menunjukkan dalam jangka masa setahun ia berada paras paling kukuh iaitu pada paras 4.2429 dan ini dalam jangka masa setahun. Kalau boleh saya tunjukkan dalam jangka masa seminggu daripada 22 hari bulan Januari sehinggalah hari ini pada 9.22 pagi, ringgit itu pada paras 4.729 dan pergerakan itu berlega-lega sekitar 4.745 sehinggalah bawah sedikit 4.715 dan paling orang kata paling merosot adalah pada Januari 2024 pada 22 hari bulan dengan paras ataupun berada di paras 4.7124 berbanding dolar Amerika dan anda boleh lihat ringgit itu paling menyusut pada 20 hari bulan daripada 23 hari bulan 2024 dan berada pada paras 4.74 dan ini perbandingan yang anda dapat lihat pada sekitar seminggu dalam jangka masa seminggu yang bermula pada 22 sehinggalah hari ini 29 Januari 2024 dan ini adalah prestasi ringgit untuk setakat hari ini dan saya boleh teruskan dengan pergerakan ataupun pasaran bursa di mana momentum aliran meningkat di Bursa Malaysia dijangka berterusan minggu ini dengan peniaga kekal optimis dan berhati-hati terhadap perkembangan luaran. Naib Presiden Pendidikan Ekuiti Rakuten Trade Senia Berhad, Tong Pat Ling berkata, pihaknya mekalkan unjuran positif disokong oleh penilaian menarik dan peningkatan keyakinan pelabur berdasarkan jumlah dagangan harian purata lebih tinggi dan pembelian asing yang kukuh. Beliau berkata walau bagaimanapun, firma pemberokokan itu tidak menoleh kemungkinan aktiviti pengambilan untung berlaku minggu ini.
Katanya indeks utama mengalami peningkatan semula dan dapat melepasi paras rintangan tidak berubah 1,500 pada Rabu lepas. Selepas memaparkan 5 corak kenaikan positif berturut-turut, indeks itu memberi petanda minat belian yang berterusan menunjukkan potensi untuk pergerakan menaik tambahan. Tong berkata tahap rintangan seterusnya dikenal pasti pada 1,527 dan menandakan momentum menaik tambahan jika boleh melepasi paras itu. Beliau berkata sebaliknya, paras sokongan kritikal ditetapkan pada 1,477 dan sebarang penurunan di bawah paras itu akan mendorong penilaian semula terhadap pendirian kukuh jangka pendek Rakuten Trade untuk indeks penanda aras tersebut. Oleh itu, pihaknya menjangkakan FBM KLCI berada dalam aliran berjulat 1,495 hingga 1,515 minggu ini. Tong berkata pasaran tempatan akan bertindak balas terhadap data inflasi Amerika Syarikat pada Jumaat dan akan memantau rapat mesyuarat Rizab Persekutuan Amerika Syarikat, The Fed, tidak lama lagi untuk menilai prospek kadar faedah. Data indeks pengurus pembelian China bagi Januari akan dikeluarkan minggu ini yang juga akan memberikan lebih banyak petunjuk mengenai aktiviti perniagaan. Bagi dagangan yang baru berakhir minggu ini, bursa tempatan dipengaruhi oleh kemungkinan pengurangan kadar faedah Amerika Syarikat, rangsangan ekonomi China serta keputusan mengenai kadar dasar semalaman OPR Bank Negara Malaysia BNM. Jawatankuasa Dasar Monetary MPC BNM menerusi mesyuarat pertamanya tahun ini pada Rabu memutuskan OPR dikekalkan pada 3% bagi kali keempat berturut-turut. FBM KLCI bergerak dalam persekitaran pasaran yang stabil melepasi paras psikologi 1,500 dan mencatatkan kenaikan selama 5 hari berturut-turut pada Jumaat. Bursa Malaysia dan anak-anak syarikatnya ditutup pada Khamis susulan hari kelepasan am perayaan Taipusam. Pada asas Jumaat ke Jumaat, indeks utama meningkat 19.91 mata kepada 1,506.28 daripada 1,486.37 minggu sebelumnya. Jumlah dagangan mingguan susut kepada 14.42 bilion unit bernilai 9.63 bilion ringgit daripada 25.91 bilion unit bernilai 14.69 bilion ringgit pada minggu lepas. Jumlah dagangan pasaran utama berkurangan kepada 8.65 bilion saham bernilai 8.53 bilion ringgit daripada 16.10 bilion saham bernilai 12.79 bilion ringgit pada minggu sebelumnya.
Baik, saya akan kongsikan pergerakan saham untuk hari ini setakat jam 9.11 pagi hari ini. Ia menunjukkan ia berada paras 1,509.51 mata dan ini peningkatan sebanyak 0.24% dan juga peningkatan 3.54 mata. Dan ini yang terbaru ialah 1,509.82. Dan kalau boleh saya tunjukkan dalam jangka masa 5 hari, kecuali hari Khamis untuk cuti Taipusam, yang menunjukkan peningkatan yang positif dan berada melebihi paras 1,510 dan kalau boleh saya tunjukkan pada awal tadi pada 9.10 ia melepasi ataupun berada paras 1,511 dan ini akan memberikan jangkaan ataupun menarik pelabur luar di luar sana dan ini merupakan positif, akan memberikan impak yang positif pada pelabur luar dan juga Dr. Afzal Nizam, pakar ekonomi, menjangkakan ia akan mencecah paras 1,600 pada hujung tahun ini dan saya boleh kongsikan untuk perkembangan seterusnya. Kontrak niaga hadapan minyak sawit mentah MSM di Bursa Malaysia Derivatives dijangka didagangkan dalam jajaran kecil pada minggu ini susulan aktiviti pengambilan untung selepas kenaikan baru-baru ini. Peniaga minyak sawit David Eng melihat harga akan bergerak antara RM3,900 dan RM4,080 satu tan.
Beliau berkata harga niaga hadapan terus kekal menghampiri paras rintangan psikologi RM4,000 setan, memandangkan sentimen pasaran terus disokong oleh kebimbangan berterusan terhadap pengeluaran serta paras stok yang agak rendah. Ketua Penyidikan Komoditi Sunvin Group dari Mumbai, Anil Kumar Bagani berkata, disebabkan musim pengeluaran yang lebih rendah, minyak sawit berkemungkinan kekal pada kadar yang lebih ketat atau malah pada premium berbanding pesaingnya, minyak soya dan bunga matahari, sekurang-kurangnya sehingga penghujung suku pertama 2024. Data pengeluaran minyak sawit Persatuan Minyak Sawit Malaysia MPOA mulai 1 hingga 20 Januari menunjukkan pengurangan di bawah 16% dan UOB Kay Hian menganggarkan pengeluaran menurun daripada 10% kepada 14%. Data bagi ekspor dari Intertek Testing Services ITS menunjukkan ekspor minyak sawit Malaysia pada 1 hingga 25 Januari berada pada 1.06 juta tan, meningkat 0.64% berbanding tempoh 1 hingga 25 Disember. Katanya pasaran kini menunggu data pengeluaran minyak sawit South Peninsula Mills bersama-sama dengan anggaran ekspor minyak sawit Malaysia oleh MSPEC dan Society General de Surveillance SGS. Anil Kumar memberitahu inventory minyak sawit China telah merosot serta bekalan untuk Januari dan Februari nampaknya tidak mencukupi yang boleh membawa kepada pembelian minyak-minyak sayuran yang lebih tinggi oleh China khususnya menjelang festival musim bunga bermula dari 9 Februari. Sebelum ini, beliau juga meramalkan prospek permintaan yang lebih baik menjelang Ramadan dan bulan-bulan perayaan. Beliau menyatakan ekspor minyak sawit Malaysia berada pada trend yang lebih tinggi berbanding Disember 2023 serta jangkaan duty dan levy ekspor Indonesia meningkat lagi untuk 1 hingga 15 Februari akan menyokong harga minyak sawit. Untuk minggu yang baru berakhir, niaga hadapan MSM didagangkan kebanyakannya lebih tinggi selari dengan prestasi harga minyak kacang soya serta minyak mentah dan disokong oleh peningkatan jangkaan terhadap kelemahan dalam pengeluaran minyak sawit Malaysia. Niaga hadapan MSM menyentuh lagi paras RM4,000 minggu lalu. Paras terakhir ini dilihat pada November 2023.
Moving on, Malaysia is making strides towards sustainability and its target of achieving net zero emissions by 2050 with the launch of Industry, Environmental, Social and Governance or IESG framework and is actively pursuing sustainability through its Budget 2024 initiatives. Furthermore, the new Industrial Master Plan 2030 or NIMP 2030 suggests a commitment to environmental and social sustainability, and Manage Engine emphasizes the importance of using technology to drive sustainable change and highlights the role of organizations and individuals in altering their habits for a more sustainable future. So to discuss further, ready on the line is Rajesh Ganasan, the President of Manage Engine. Good morning.
Good morning, Ms. Nabilah. Thanks for having me on the show.
No problem. All right, Rajesh, according to a report, Keeping Watch Monitoring Your Path to a Sustainable IT by PESLA, it stated that 52% of businesses in Southeast Asia are still developing sustainable practices, and which include a sustainability framework. So how is the current ecosystem like in Malaysia right now regarding sustainability practices in digital transformation?
Yeah, like you said, as I said, I represent Manage Engine. We produce and sell software to manage the technology infrastructure in companies, including companies in Malaysia. We interact with our customers. One good thing that we see, that we observe in Southeast Asia, particularly Malaysia, the conversations are around sustainability now. We talk to the CIOs in big corporations, government agencies, small businesses, because of the master plan that you were talking about. Previously, it used to be about the functionality of the software, their business objectives, cybersecurity. But now the emphasis is also around sustainability. When we talk about sustainability, people do ask us, right? So it's not just about the term sustainability. The better term is to how do we achieve this net zero goal, right? So reduce carbon. That is where they expect the software. Say, for example, the data centers. the technologies deployed in data centers are not really sustainability friendly today. The amount of hardware that goes in, amount of cooling that it needs, the processing power that it needs. You need software that can monitor the usage of these energy sources. Could be cooling, could be power. That is where a company like Manage Engine comes in. We are really optimistic about the emphasis being placed. And like you said, 52% of the company's organization in Malaysia are still in the process of planning for it. But it looks very optimistic, the situation, because people are asking about sustainability more and more than before.
All right, Roger. While data center operators strive to manage their temperature and reduce carbon emissions, businesses can also do their part by implementing different sustainable practices in working with technology. So what are some of the approaches organizations can adopt to environmental sustainability, and how technology is leveraged to achieve positive impacts in line with the national plan?
Right. Like, what are some of the things companies can do? I'll talk about what we do. We are a global corporation with 17,000 employees, and this is sort of a blueprint I see most organizations adopting. The first thing is to sort of know how much you are emitting into the environment, right? The first thing is to be aware of how much emission you are causing into the environment, because without knowing that, without the attempt to reduce what you are already emitting, it's very hard to have any program. In that sense, we have a separate division that owns sustainability as a business objective, right? So this is what most organizations should do. There are some governance framework that is available on how you sort of integrate sustainability as a program, sustainability as a governed program inside organizations. So that is what I would recommend companies start with. So this is exactly, to give you an example, this is exactly like trying to lose weight and to stay healthy. You don't watch your weight every day and expect the weight to go down. You need to watch the preceding parameters, right? So the leading parameters, which is you need to watch the calories that you consume every day. It goes, applies for the same, right? When you talk about sustainability program, first know how much emissions you are causing, and you can know that only when you have good monitoring systems in place, right? So to know how much you are burning, and then comes your initiative to applying green practices, right? So invest in green energy, solar energy, like regions like Malaysia, or I live in India. So we have plenty of green energy sources available. And then any business function today could be very, very environmental conscious. They can travel less, they can use papers less. How do they recycle their hardware? You bring one aspect at a time into your practice. First, watch the leading indicators, know how much you are burning, and then identify aspects on how you can apply alternatives. So simple, a couple of steps, couple of approaches, but all it needs is call for a big mindset change, right? And that is where companies struggle, and that is where I would recommend companies start with respect to how do they approach sustainability.
So how can actually businesses integrate sustainability into their IT infrastructure monitoring tools to help organizations improve their sustainable practices, which in turn can also lead to enhanced productivity and also efficiency?
Absolutely. Like we talk about getting sustainability integrated into the IT infrastructure. What typically happens in IT infrastructure? Businesses today are chasing their objectives, the business goals, right? 2-3 years ago, we were talking about the blockchain technology. And in the last couple of years, we are talking about generative AI. Businesses are always in this race, right? So of applying, adopting the latest and greatest technology. But again, applying technology for the sake of technology, right? Just to be relevant is not necessarily the right approach. You always need the balance, right? So that is what we always recommend. It is okay to bring technology like generative AI, but please understand, right? So the kind of impact it could make on the environment. So always have a monitoring system. I always try to give example. it is like buying a great new sports car, right? Just because you can drive it at 300 miles per hour, you don't necessarily drive at that speed all the time in your road. You need to comply to some regulations. You need to comply to some laws, and the same applies for sustainability also. Go for adopting the latest technology, but also operate your technology within the frameworks of compliance, your laws, and also sustainability. And companies like us, vendors like us, we provide software to always monitor. Right? You can bring in blockchain, you can move to cloud, you could have hybrid working environment. Your workforce could be working from remote using multitudes of devices, right? You could be using generative AI as a technology, but we provide software to help you monitor how much you are consuming in terms of energy, how much you are emitting into the environment, all of that. So we create the visibility with which companies can confidently move on to the next step, which is to execute and run a good sustainability governance program.
All right, Rajesh, we have about 2 minutes left. May I talk about the cybersecurity in terms of IT management?
Right.
Sustainable initiatives succeed only when the technology is well defended against potential damages. Hence, what role does cybersecurity play in building a sustainable future, and how do organizations contribute to this aspect?
Interesting question. This is something many of our customers ask. It comes in many conversations. So how does cybersecurity play a role? I generally don't tend to look at cybersecurity as a separate aspect. When you have technology infrastructure, cybersecurity is a very, very important underpinning. So all that I said previously, right? So your outlook, your approach to sustainability should not exclude anything, including cybersecurity. Like how you run your technology infrastructure, cybersecurity is very much part of your overall program. It includes running your data center operations, so monitoring your entire infrastructure, keeping them secure, at the same time also have sustainability goals bring in, right? So what could be the fallout of not having this approach, where you tend to outsource security? Because every organization today, right, especially those who are in the cloud business, are perennially under attack. If you are on the cloud, you have to assume you're always under attack. If you don't have good cybersecurity, you're going to waste a lot of resources. You are going to be under attack. You will be thwarting attacks, or you would be responding to attacks all the time. This means more energy consumption, right? So that is how I would want to look at it. When you have cybersecurity as an important underpinning, you are basically avoiding a lot of attacks fundamentally, and that would indirectly help you, right? So from saving a lot of energy that you would otherwise be spending in managing all these cyber attacks. And that would be our approach to including cybersecurity in the overall sustainability program.
All right, well, indeed, bridging the gap between digital transformation and sustainability to make database decisions can actually result in resource optimization and also bring economic benefits for businesses. So I would like to say thank you to Rajesh Ganesan, the president of Manage Engine. You can find the whole discussion on all of our digital platform of Astro AWANI. Baik, pembayaran sumbangan tunai rahmah STR Fasa 1 akan bermula hari ini kepada 8.2 juta penerima yang berdaftar dalam pangkalan data STR. Kementerian Kewangan MOF dalam satu kenyataan sebelum ini memaklumkan pembayaran itu akan dibuat kepada penerima melalui pengkreditan ke akaun bank atau secara tunai melalui Bank Simpanan Nasional BSN secara berperingkat mengikut kategori kelayakan STR masing-masing. Menurut kenyataan itu, kerajaan telah menaikkan bayaran STR Fasa 1 kepada RM500 bagi penerima kategori isi rumah berbanding bayaran maksimum RM300 pada tahun lalu bagi membantu sebilangan besar rakyat menangani kesan peningkatan kos sara hidup. Bagi Fasa 1, penerima kategori isi rumah berpendapatan RM2,500 dan ke bawah akan menerima RM500. Isi rumah berpendapatan RM2,501 hingga RM5,000 menerima RM100 hingga RM300. Manakala warga emas tiada pasangan dan golongan bujang masing-masing menerima RM150 dan RM100. Sejumlah 20,000 peluang pekerjaan dijangka diwujudkan di bawah projek Inisiatif Pendapatan Rakyat Inisiatif Usahawan Tani Wilayah Ekonomi Koridor Utara atau IPR Intan NCER menjelang akhir tahun 2025. Menteri Ekonomi Rafizi Ramli berkata, setakat ini terdapat 1,200 peserta yang menyertai projek IPR Intan NCER di seluruh negara.
Bagaimanapun katanya, lebih banyak tanah diperlukan untuk memperluaskan projek pertanian moden itu.
Saya tak melihat IPR ini sebagai bertani. Saya melihatnya sebagai mewujudkan peluang pekerjaan, terutamanya di kawasan-kawasan luar bandar yang kita memang tak boleh bawa kilang. Jadi daripada kita susah payah bawa kilang ataupun bawa jabatan kerajaan buka pejabat baru kat situ, cara terbaik untuk mewujudkan peluang pekerjaan di kawasan pedalaman ialah kita bawa tapak IPR. 0.5 hektar seorang.
Beliau berkata demikian ketika berucap pada program lawatan Perdana Menteri ke projek IPR Intan NCER di Hospital Bahagia Ulu Kinta pada Ahad. Menurutnya, peluang pekerjaan yang disasarkan untuk golongan miskin tegar dan miskin itu bersamaan dengan mewujudkan 200 pusat data di seluruh negara. Sebelum ini, media melaporkan terdapat 5 ladang dibuka di bawah projek IPR Intan NCER yang dijangka akan mengeluarkan lebih 2,100 tan hasil tanaman cili, jagung dan terung dengan nilai pasaran lebih 29 juta ringgit. Program itu akan membuka lebih banyak peluang pekerjaan sekaligus menjana pendapatan kepada golongan terlibat dalam industri pertanian moden itu.
Baik, selepas ini kami akan kongsikan sedikit perkongsian dari Forum Ekonomi Dunia di Davos, Switzerland. Jadi kami akan berhenti rehat seketika, kembali selepas ini.
Kerjasama lebih erat untuk bagaimana memperkuat ASEAN. ASEAN sekarang kan di crossroad, jadi Indonesia dan Malaysia bisa menjadi pilar untuk memperkuat kesatuan dari ASEAN.
So we see a tremendous future for hydrogen to be a part of the decarbonization of the planet. At this point of time, Malaysia and India, and where we have been sort of focusing on developing projects.
He looks so handsome today.
Kebahagiaan yang penuh kepura-puraan.
Nampaknya agak kena hati-hati dengan Cik Mariam tu. Terketik depan Cik Aziz. Hai Puan Zaidah.
Kecurangan yang berjaya dikaburi.
Saya sepatutnya kena balik lah.
Siapa yang takut sangat lah? Takut kena tinggal ke?
Akhirnya rahsia terbongkar jua. Layang-layang perkahwinan di Astro dan On Demand. Mereka ini ria-ria ubi berisi.
Rezeki tak salah tumpat. Tumpat tu nama tempatan tu, tumpat. Why you should buy the property? Kuda yang mana? Kuda yang mana? Siapa ni?
Selebriti undangan yang akan memukau mati anda.
Ingat kat mana ni? Baru paham. Kan dah lawak betul ni. Tengok kau betul-betul aku gelap.
Ubi Superstar Live musim baru di Astro Warna dan Astro Go.
Usaha membawa pulang wanita Sarawak yang terkandas di Filipina melibatkan implikasi undang-undang yang perlu diteliti. Jumlah mangsa ribut dan banjir di Pusat Pembinaan Sementara PPS di Sarawak kini hanya menempatkan 72 mangsa banjir.
Murid, guru dan anggota kumpulan pelaksana di semua institusi pendidikan hanya perlu memakai baju seragam untuk 2 hari seminggu, sementara 2 hari lagi pakaian sukan dan 1 hari lagi pakaian co-curriculum.
Excellent. Thank you very much for coming this afternoon. So the panel today, we're going to talk about regulating non-bank financial institutions. Well, what are non-bank financial institutions? Surely one of the worst acronyms anybody could come up with, just designed to like put your relatives and friends to sleep. But in fact, you know, I'm going to explain their significance just with a couple of statistics. And these are from Gary Gensler, who's the chairman of the Securities and Exchange Commission. He said, as of now, in the United States, private markets are now a $25 trillion asset class. That's more than U.S. commercial bank assets. In 2022, private markets raised $3.7 trillion compared to $1 trillion in public markets. Now, what do these private markets represent? The reason I bring up this statistic is that they, for the most part, represent the activity of what we call these non-bank financial institutions. Now, some of these have been around a long time. Bond markets are as old, they're centuries old. We've had pension funds, mutual funds, life insurance companies, long time. But, in the last few decades, they've been joined through financial innovation by things like exchange-traded funds, leverage loans, syndicated loans, private equity, venture capital, and now, of course, perhaps the biggest and fastest growing private credit. And these represent tremendous opportunities and benefits, through the force of financial innovation. But they also have risks. And you only have to go back 16 years ago when we had the global financial crisis, which was a crisis rooted in the excesses and the failures of what we at the time called shadow banks, which is really just a euphemism for non-bank financial institutions. So essentially, what we want to do is talk about the two sides of that equation: an asset class which has a lot of benefit and potential, but poses important risks at the micro and the macro level. And to talk about this question, we have a really amazing panel. On my left is His Excellency Mohammed Al Jadaan, the Finance Minister of Saudi Arabia, and I think we were just discussing now the longest-serving Finance Minister of the G20. Take that out. Lucky you. To your left. Ann Walsh, Chief Investment Officer and Managing Partner at Guggenheim Investments. Evan Siddell of the Alberta Investment Management Company, fellow Canadian like me, and knowing Canada, I guess we can call the Alberta Fund basically a sovereign wealth fund, right, Evan?
Yeah, that's right, actually. Yeah. We do run part of a sovereign wealth fund, yeah.
Yeah, that's right. And on the far left, Steve Tannenbaum, who's the founder of Golden Tree Asset Management, one of the biggest players in this space. So people very well equipped to talk about this. Steve, I'm going to talk with you, and I'm going to actually start with the premise that I put out there. 15 years ago, I was as a reporter writing about the collapse of non-bank financial institutions, left, right, and center, the bailouts that were necessary, never again, financial crisis. Here we are 16 years later. By the broadest definition, these markets are even bigger. Should we be worried?
So, are we in better shape than 15 years ago? Yeah. Absolutely. If you look at the leverage in the system 15 years ago, was just a multiple, and you can measure it through really the leverage in banks, and you could see how the return on equity in the banks was so elevated because of the leverage. In terms of the environment or the market getting bigger, well, that's a function of the world growth of the economy. Mm-hmm. There's a demand for this credit. So if the economy wasn't growing, actually, if it were the same size, that would be pretty scary, because the economy would suggest that the world economies are not growing. So I feel like we're in much better shape. That's not to say you take something like the pandemic and you see something like mortgage REITs, which had margin leverage, which seemed like a smart idea at the time until it wasn't, and they basically all had margin calls. So there was a run on that sector of finance during the pandemic, but broadly speaking, the system is much better. I think, and you continue as some of the episodes of last year with Silicon Valley Bank, Credit Suisse. There's certainly a refinement, but broadly speaking, much better.
May I pick up on that? Because if you looked at the share of non-bank financial institutions, according to the FSB, in financial assets, it was 47% in 2007. Today, it's 47%. So apropos of your comment, the world just got bigger. Now, it's a big problem because it's a lot of numbers, but the world is safer in the sense because their banks now hold more capital, so they have less leverage. They're more regulated from a liquidity point of view. The fact that we have, and by we I include a pension fund as one of the shadow banks, have occupied some of that territory. We do not engage in maturity transformation. We do track our liquidity, and we have far less leverage than a bank, which would be 24 to 25 to 1. Inherently, the world is a safer place. That's an intended consequence, I think, of the capital regulations imposed on banks, that activity went into the so-called shadow banking sector.
To just add to what Eric said, it's a broad topic, is probably in 2007, there was a heads I win and tails you lose kind of setup. And I think that that's been largely more even-handed, even from a what the banks can do and can't do, from a compensation structure where you're not paid all at once. So there's a lot of, I think, improvements to the system.
Are the instruments fundamentally different today than they were 15 or 16 years ago?
There's always evolving. So the short answer is there opportunistic ways that people want to have credit? Is there a more efficient way to get credit for more plain vanilla? Yes. So there are improvements evolving, and credit's evolved. Would I say it's materially different in terms of what the purpose is? Not really. In terms of how it's executed, absolutely.
I would say I hope so. The short answer to your question is I really hope so. I mean, with the evolution of the fintech over the last 10, 15 years, I think we should be expecting significantly different products and different choices, different risk, different investors base, and different borrowers base or beneficiaries base as a result of that. But obviously, it is all also about credit. I mean, it's at the end of the day, it's just being able to provide credit faster, cheaper, and with more choices.
If I could add on to the comments of His Excellency with regard to, there's a couple of other things too, and that is the synthetically created securities, CDO squared and the like. They failed in the late 1990s. And there were short memories because then they became reinvigorated and became a big part of the leading edge of the problem when the financial crisis occurred. And if we're kind of thinking about the one word that is probably the most important for regulators and investors to be thinking about, and that is the extreme levels of leverage that can be created, and an extremely risky area would be synthetically. And so as long as we don't see that and the rise of that, and I hope our memories aren't terribly short with regard to the impact of those types of transactions.
Memories are very short. I mean, how long was it between the 1990s and 2000?
That's right. That kind of has me worried a little bit. But
put it this way: 2008 is further from us now than the 1990s were from 2008. So but Anne, I actually want to stay with you for a second because His Excellency did mention that, with fintech, there's been a variety of growth of types of instruments. But the question I want to ask you, so Jamie Dimon unfortunately could not be here. So I'm going to pretend to be Jamie Dimon. And if I'm Jamie Dimon, I'm going to say the only reason this private market grows is because we as banks, we have capital requirements, which are bigger than ever, more stricter than ever. We have liquidity requirements, which are more onerous than ever. My risk controls are being checked all the time. I am held to disclosure requirements and so forth. And plus, I get called before Congress every 6 months and get, the stuffing beaten out of me, right? Yeah. That's why your market has grown, because it's an arbitrage play. You don't bear any of those costs. What's the answer to that?
Well, with all due respect to Jamie Dimon, I think it's a little bit more fundamental than that. And that is the capital markets, particularly as I think about the U.S., have changed dramatically over the last number of years. We've gone from a world where there were many, many publicly listed companies in the U.S. We're down to about 3,600 listed stocks in the U.S., and contrast that with private equity-owned companies, that has exploded to about 5,500. Crossover point was reached about 7-8 years ago now. And so as a result, private equity companies are not going to be coming to the public markets, and they're less so inclined to come to the broadly syndicated loan market through banks as well. That leaves this opportunity set for private investors to become the lender of choice, also to work closely with private equity sponsors in order to provide the necessary capital. So I think it's part of a larger narrative with regard to the development and evolution of the capital markets.
Can I just comment on this? I think, first of all, there is a definition problem. We just need to make sure that we really understand exactly what we are talking about. When we talk about non-bank financial institutions, I mean, these are possibly investment banks who are actually heavily regulated. Pension funds, which in a lot of jurisdictions are very heavily regulated. But it could be other credit providers who are lightly, in a lot of jurisdictions, lightly regulated. I think for me, what we are talking about is institutions that create credit and provide credit. Okay, so that's, hopefully we agree on this. If you disagree. Yes. So that's number one. Number two, there is fundamental difference in these institutions. Who takes depositors' money and who doesn't? And the difference here is not actually on the operational side, or it is actually on stakeholders on the table of making decisions. So if you are a bank taking deposits, actually the owners of your bank are not on the table in the boardroom when you make decisions and take risks. They are the depositors who are not represented. And this is why central banks actually play that role. They play actually the role of the owner, the depositors, to protect the depositors. So that's why we get used over decades and possibly even hundreds of years of central banks focusing on deposit takers, regulating them heavily to make sure that the money of the depositors are not put in undue risk. That is, to me, is totally different from mature investors who choose to provide credit and assess their own risks, and they are on the table, or their representatives. They should be allowed to take that risk.
So, Evan, I know you want to come in here, but actually, my next question is going to go to you anyway, right?
Okay.
So
I'm going
to force you to answer the question I'm going to ask as opposed to what you want to be asked, okay? And so I want to actually pick up on that point, Your Excellency, exactly that point, because again, like the historical argument for there being a perimeter between the bank and the non-bank sector is exactly what you said. The banks, their liability holders are depositors who are insured by the federal government, right? You know, so different form of moral hazard, right? Different in people involved, you know? So, but all those arguments were true in 2008, and yet we had a crisis that required the intervention by the authorities, significant like backstopping by the sovereign in many countries of like many non-banks. And I talk about Lehman Brothers, I talk about AIG, I talk about Fannie and Freddie, I talk about like all the structured investment vehicles, money market funds, okay, you know, reserve fund broke the buck, right? Required a complete federal backstop of the entire money market complex, which was supposed to be not like any of these things. So the point I'm trying to make here is that I understand the point you're making, but where's the assurance that these things will not become systemic? And just to make my point a little bit better, we don't have a regulator on the panel, so I'm kind of being the regulator here, right? Okay. So this is what the IMF wrote 8 months ago. The combination of poor market liquidity, high leverage, high degree of interconnectedness between the non-banks and the banks is most dangerous to the financial system because it can amplify asset price changes and then spread stress. So that is my question to you, Evan, is that given that we have seen episodes where in spite of the perimeter that you've identified, non-bank stress has required the intervention of the authorities, what do we do?
It's true, and we've had that experience in Canada where the Caisse de dépôt, one of the pension funds, actually had some ABCP structures that collapsed. The Bank of Canada had to jump in and support them. Secondly, another pension fund had significant liquidity squeeze as a result of derivatives and hedges. The Bank of Canada had to support them. So what we've done as an industry is we're now self-regulating, and this is not going to be an appealing answer to this crowd, but self-regulating our own liquidity. We do a stressed liquidity coverage ratio, as banks do, because the end of liquidity for a pension fund is disastrous. We don't have a leverage problem, but we may indeed, so we don't have a solvency problem. We may indeed have a liquidity problem, and we report to the Bank of Canada on a formal basis that way. That's just, but the problem with shadow banks is it's not a monolithic solution. As His Excellency said, there's a different social contract with banks, and you said this, Greg, different social contract with banks that have deposit insurance and access to the central bank than people like us who don't, unless we're given it. And as a result, it's a little rich of Jamie, this is my point, to talk about regulatory arbitrage when that's exactly what he was engaging in. He was engaging in a too big to fail arbitrage that he'd get backstopped, and the moral hazard supporting that is what we've tried to move out of the system. If market discipline is regulating the markets, that's a good place to start, not a bad place to start.
I'd also add, just with the IMF, of course the banks are going to be working with whoever to facilitate transactions. So that's kind of an evergreen. Or you're going to have many institutions, many financial players who are working to bring about the maximum price. And if they weren't able to work together, it would result in lower prices. So the fact that banks and private credit lenders are working together, to me, is pretty typical, and in fact that they're trying to amplify their division of labor is, makes a lot of sense. So the issue that I see is just more, is it responsible? And it's certainly furthering growth. I think one of the issues is to balance, as you talked about on your first question to me, is it's natural for credit to be growing because it means the economy is growing. And so it's natural for banks to work with shadow banks or, unregulated financial institutions.
Okay. Well, the Securities and Exchange Commission, as you probably know, last year, looking at the private market question, decided that there was a lack of adequate regulation in this field. And so they put a proposal, a set of comments that would affect many of the individuals on this panel. They basically want a lot of these private asset managers to basically pursue greater disclosure with respect to fees, with respect to performance, perhaps like assume greater liability in the field of negligence and so on. These have not been well received by the industry. Like Steve or Anne, do you want to comment on whether you think the SEC has got it right or wrong?
So I think the SEC has been able to touch the private credit market and industry through marketing and the usual rules on as you mentioned, fees and disclosure of returns. Where the industry is concerned, and maybe this is not necessarily in support of the industry, is particularly in the case of valuation and pricing. Yeah. And so there's not been a lot of volatility in the price of private credit in particular, or private transactions, relatively speaking, because there's not the same level of price discovery as there is in public markets. And I think this is one angle that the SEC would like to spend a lot more time on. More broadly, away from the SEC, regulators are concerned, and including Federal Reserve officials, are concerned about the lack of transparency more broadly into the investment practices and lending practices of the private credit industry. And unless somehow an ETF or other mutual fund gets formed where these private credit transactions are offered to the retail investor, I think there will continue to be a separation between the regulators and private credit. We've seen in bank loan space where the syndicated loan market has entered into the retail product space with these offerings. And they have a number of issues. One, you can't transfer, in the case of an ETF, you can't transfer a bank loan into an individual's portfolio. So if for some reason there was something to ever happen to that particular transaction or that structure, the outcome would be probably pretty troubled. We haven't been tested in that situation. And so private credit, as long as it doesn't end up somehow trying to attract the individual investor as a participant, I think can continue to argue that they do not need to be regulated in the same way.
So I'm going to share another statistic with you. In 1983, 2% of households fit the definition of accredited investor, wealthy enough that they didn't have to be treated like a retail investor. That figure today is 18.5% because the threshold has never been adjusted for inflation or income growth. So we have a large segment of the U.S. population, I can't speak for Canada or other countries, which could potentially be attracted to this asset class right now. So I think that raises the question, is the SEC directionally right, Steve? Should there be more, at least to protect that growing segment of the population that could be involved?
So a couple things. First is just to get back to regulation on marking, third-party marks and a common established pricing methodology is really important, for confidence, and also as economic environments change and industry prospects change, I think it's important to have confidence that there was a consistent methodology. So I think that's something that should continue to be developed, and I think it also makes results much more uniform and comparable. In terms of, it'll be interesting what the alpha that's added with some of the alternative programs on retail. So just having a name brand without the alpha, I think has a lot more issues than whether they should be able to buy it or not. So I think that's another issue. And from a financial advisor, just saying that you can get X, Y, and Z, a piece of X, Y, and Z without looking at what the value that's added with all the extra fees or what's been added given the size that some of these institutions have grown to. So I think that's going to be, whether they're good investments to me, that's how I start thinking about it.
Yeah.
And it seems like many of them haven't been.
Greg, I'd say part of our job as pension fund managers, because we wouldn't be included in your stat on accredited investors, but we basically are an aggregation of non-accredited investors that through us become accredited and participate in those markets. And that's an adjustment that works, right? That purchasing power comes together in a way that can participate in a market in an informed way.
But also, there's another added element to that, and that is in the case of a retail product, the regulator has certain disclosure requirements because the retail investor can't themselves do the level of due diligence that you can.
Yeah.
And in today's market, the aggregator, if you want to refer to yourself as that, then is performing the due diligence. And I can tell you, sitting on the asset manager side, the due diligence
You don't go light.
You don't go light. That's right. And so, in fact, I would say it's more rigorous even than what the SEC might actually have, mandated in terms of disclosure. So you take the place of that regulator in that way, and as long as that continues to function strongly, then again, I think that can give some comfort to investors.
A regulator?
No, I said no, in the place of.
You were once a regulator. Right? In fact,
can I just make a comment? I think there are multiple points that you mentioned and the colleagues that really warrants just reflection. Number one, I think when you talked about government intervention and the fact that they jumped into other institutions to save them, I think governments does not take light bailing out institutions. Yeah. So they know this is taxpayers' money, public money, and they need to assess really what is the public good that is behind it. They bailed out car manufacturers in the US before. They have nothing to do with the financial system for some good cause, strategic cause. But in this context, I think a lot of it, actually, the reason is you will find that the buck stops at a bank that has not been regulated properly enough, and they do want that bank to be exposed to these institutions' failures. Yeah. So they need to save these institutions to save the banks. The second point is, I think there is a big difference between regulating and awareness. And the government has a role to play in raising the awareness of investors, particularly retail investors or investors who are considered sophisticated, but they are not sophisticated enough. Because a lot of times, if you don't raise that awareness, even if they are technically qualified as qualified investors, they can be manipulated. Obviously, the players or the ecosystem is smart enough to put that small print that will just satisfy the light regulations, but you need investors who are savvy, you need to raise awareness, and you need even to encourage them to use sophisticated asset managers who are able to do that due diligence on their behalf. The last point I want to say is we need to be very careful not to apply regulatory framework that applies to banks to non-bank financial institutions. Very careful, because that could potentially kill innovation. That could potentially actually deprive investments, deprive private sectors and others from credit that can be provided by institutions that are willing to take higher risk than banks would have taken.
Have you actually seen that tension in the Saudi context?
Absolutely. I mean, in Saudi, I can give an example now. It is done, and behind us, the Capital Market Authority started allowing one fund to basically lend to small and medium enterprises. And the central bank was not comfortable with that. And they wanted actually to apply the regulatory framework that applies to financing companies that are supervised by the central bank. And there was a tension. Ultimately, the two regulators had to sit down together and say, what is it that we are worried about? Mm-hmm. Why are you not allowing funds to actually lend investors money who are willing, when they subscribed on the units of this fund, to lend? Is it systemic risk? We can understand. Then just restrict their ability to access banks' money to a certain limit. so that there is no exposure. But for you then to just say, because they may cause systemic risk, we need to be harsh on their regulatory framework so that they will not pose any risk, I think you are potentially depriving your economy from growth significantly.
And are there instances where what is purportedly concerned about systemic risk or prudential risk actually just rent-seeking? It's in some sense the banks and their representatives trying to protect their status?
Absolutely.
I think competition plays, but there are other reasons the industry players would
We've stepped into the regional banking space in the U.S. in a significant way in the last year, and so we're taking up the demand or supply, I guess, that
To clarify, you're buying regional banks or you're competing
No,
for
we're
credit?
competing for credit, so engaging in private debt, either through funds or directly on our own. We estimate that $1 trillion of M&A activity happened because people like us stepped into the market when regional banks went away. So that's kept the economy going in a way.
Yeah.
That's a good outcome.
Historically, if you look at the 90s, where the regional banks would do LBO lending, it was a tough space for them. And it was a space where there were a lot of charge-offs, usually during recessions, which didn't justify the lending during the good times. And what we saw was they felt very confident at charging 600 or 700 basis points over LIBOR, now SOFR, but we're not so confident with 1,000. So pricing was also tough historically, I found, for regional banks, particularly at the wider level. For us, a basic thesis would be, what's the risk-adjusted spread? So basically, what's your gross yield minus expected default, accounting for the volatility of outcome.
Yeah.
And that's not necessarily what it seemed like they were broadly speaking at in the 90s and early 2000s, how they operated. And as a result, people who are more confident taking that approach took a lot of market share.
Are you saying that basically for their own institutional reasons, there were certain credits that they simply would not lend to because their default probabilities were too high, even in a scenario where the risk-adjusted return was appropriate?
Actually, I would just add something to that, and they weren't terribly confident about which ones those were.
Okay.
And that created the opportunity.
So you're saying basically the private credit market fills a gap that literally would not exist, at least in the U.S. context, absent. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Well, and I think to add on to that, especially in the periods of time that you're speaking of as well, those are periods of time when capital gets rationed. And banks are more likely to ration capital, relatively speaking, because they have little of it to allocate, and they are very much pro-cyclical in terms of their risk management. And so as a result, private credit does step in those particular situations. We're certainly seeing it today.
And I think that's the point you're making, Evan, about the last year where you stepped into a space in a context where these mid-sized regionals were pulling back.
That's right.
But let's, just to go back to the regulatory question for a moment. Okay, so Your Excellency, you talked about the importance of information, right? So can I get the panel to at least agree perhaps that notwithstanding where you want to go with regulation, there's something to be said for having more information out there. So I think at least, as a journalist and having talked to a lot of regulators, one of the things that bothers them is just so much that they don't know. I mean, we know a lot about banks, right? We collect information on a quarterly basis. We literally don't know the size or nature of a lot of these markets. What do the panelists feel about at least a reporting regimen so that we actually have a sense of the size and nature of this market?
So one of the benefits of private credit is actually being discreet. So it's not the main benefit. So in other words, not disclosing who's taking money if they're trying to build up, they don't want to be public with their information. So you certainly want to make sure it's marked correctly and that it's fairly valued, but a lot of the lenders don't want the information about what they're doing. If they're taking loans, who they're buying, and they're private. That's the point. So I think one of the issues of more transparency is not always right because a lot of the borrowers deliberately, for good business reasons, don't want to disclose what their borrowing is.
On a per transaction basis. But I'll tell you, from our point of view, we do disclose the aggregate level of our investments by asset class, by number and volume. We do not, and it's not by agreement, we don't disclose discrete investments, which I think is what you're talking about.
Exactly.
Banks don't disclose anyway.
Pardon?
I mean, banks don't disclose specifics.
Right. I mean, I guess I'm not thinking about like name by name disclosure, but like anonymized information that can be aggregated up so that at least on a system-wide basis, we have a sense of, you know, the nature of this market and its size.
I think, if I may, I think regulating this industry smartly is necessary to avoid systemic risks.
Okay.
And to maintain financial stability. But that is the limit. I think beyond that, and they are required to comply with US GAAP or IFRS accounting principles, and if they are public companies, they will need to publish. If they are not public, they will need to send reports to their investors. But I think we need just to make sure that we smartly regulate them, but we don't, go beyond that to intrude into their business, because that could potentially jeopardize productivity, innovation, and potentially deprive credit going to industries and individuals and businesses that need it, that they cannot get it from banks.
So even if we don't believe that there's a radically new regulatory regime that's necessary, do we think that there might still be nonetheless risks out there in the market right now? You observe this market on a daily, weekly basis. What do you think? What are the hazards that might be out there with respect to pricing, with respect to leverage, with respect to quality, and so on? Are there going to be sort of blow-ups somewhere down the line that we need to watch for?
Who's going to say no to that? I mean, the problems in the system are largely interconnectedness to institutions that are subject to runs. Banks, some other non-bank financial institutions are subject to runs, open-ended funds, for example, without gates. Broker-dealers can be too if they're financing the repo market, because the repo market is a runnable market. Attending to the level of interconnectedness of my activity, for example, and the banking system is an important thing for regulators to pay attention to, because we've got to remember 20th century financial was the trigger of the US financial crisis. Not a big institution, a quite small institution. And then there were series of, what's the term? Infection.
Contagion.
Contagion, that's the word I was looking for. Thank you, Greg, you're the journalist. Contagion in the system that resulted from that and made it much larger than it otherwise needed to be.
Yeah, but right now, we've come off a period of tremendous growth in private credit, right? I mean,
in credit.
It's very large there. And I have been in this business for longer than I care to admit in front of a public audience. And it has that kind of feel like, it's kind of like when you've had so much growth and people have made so much money for so long, there's something, something's going to blow up. You know, the old saying, like when the tide goes out, you see who's swimming naked, right? So we've just been through a period of very high interest rates. They're going to be with us for a while. Aren't there things out there that worry you?
So a few things. First, the returns. The idea that CCC to single B credit will have risk-adjusted returns of 300 to 400 basis points going forward, like they've had going backwards, is a tough bet.
Yeah.
And so the returns are going to shrink. In terms of, it's really been a substitute for what the banks used to distribute. So there was an innovation where, whether it's to pay a dividend or do an acquisition quickly. So to the extent that banks or other providers can come in quicker or cheaper, it'll probably come in. So I feel the returns are probably not going to be as excessive as they've been looking backwards. So that would be the one issue in terms of how the asset class behaves. I do feel as if the idea that if private equity is the primary issuer of private credit, the most sophisticated issuers are going to provide creditors with excess returns doesn't really seem like a great business model to bet on in the future. So I don't expect that to continue.
I think there is one risk that, in addition to what was already been said, and that is, I look at the market in two different ways. There's credit now, and within the last, say, 12 months. And then there's legacy credit in the private space that was made and issued against CCC rated borrowers in 2021 when there was a great deal of refinancing that occurred at lower rates than today. And at some point, those particular companies may in fact prove, even at their lower borrowing rate, especially if they borrowed on a floating rate that's no longer a lower rate, that they may be feeling stress if we are to see the slowdown in the economy that certainly our firm predicts, and that could be an area of risk. I think that would result in, if there's a series of defaults of size and magnitude, that will cause regulators to wonder if, in fact, the underwriting standards are as strong as the private credit industry seems to claim, and whether or not that will be a way for them to work their way into some sort of regulatory oversight. So I do have a concern about the legacy holdings.
Oh, one thing I'd add, just in private credit, I've seen the most innovation in credit in the last, call it, decade in private credit. So in the 90s, it might have been structured products. Here, so I don't want to, there's been a lot of interesting and innovative positive aspects of private credit. So I don't want to leave that out in terms of why it's been a good neighborhood to be.
Okay. I think we have some time for questions. Does anybody have any questions? Yes, can I get the microphone here too, sir? You state your name and affiliation if you could.
Thank you. My name is Khalid Dabagh. I'm the chairman of SABIC. Very interesting discussion. Very good to see some of previous friends and colleagues. I'm in the context of regulation that is being discussed. I was hoping, actually I was surprised that I didn't hear any reference to the roles of custodians and trustees. Some of them are in Guernsey, Jersey, Cayman Islands, maybe London or Frankfurt or New York. And their role in ensuring that the IPS, the investment policy statement of pension plans, of endowments, some of these pension plans and endowments are managed by firms represented here, and including BlackRock and Wellington. So what is the role of these two important players, trustees and custodian, who report on the investments to the trustees to ensure that the IPS is complied with? Thank you very much.
Yeah, very good question. Does anybody want to tackle that one?
So I think the reason that we're sort of sitting here stumped a little bit is because they don't play much of a role now.
No.
And it's really quite administrative. Should they? If assets are held in trust, absolutely. Then they do read the investment policy statement, and then they do actively engage to ensure adherence. But they don't perform any additional underwriting responsibilities. It is administrative in my experience. So I'm not sure that I see much role for them changing. And in fact, I think they want less responsibility rather than more.
Any other questions? So we've spent a lot of time talking about the regulation and risk of these things. I want to spend the last few minutes talking about the potential in the future and so on. So this an asset class that has grown and evolved and morphed. What do you see in the next few years? What new sort of markets might this market address? And in particular, I'd like the panel's thoughts on the way private credit and related private markets can assist in the needs of emerging markets, which have enormous capital requirements in the next few years, things for poverty reduction, things for infrastructure, things for green transition. Anybody want to tackle that one?
We're engaged through an organization, we at AIMCO are engaged in an organization called the Investor Leadership Network in mobilizing private capital, particularly for transition finance opportunities. So we have a transition finance pool that it's just slightly over $1 billion. Our fund's about 120, so it's not that large, or that will be oriented towards that. We're also talking to our Canadian government about effectively war bonds. Governments can put their own security and credit behind a risk that we wouldn't otherwise want to take, de-risk it, and then we will commit to that in a significant way. Because we want
sounds like Brady bonds.
It would be rather like Brady bonds. That's exactly right. Yeah.
Yeah, basically providing the first loss portion, as it were.
Right.
Yeah.
Sure.
Steve, you're
blended finance. I'm sorry. Blended finance through them or through multilateral development banks would be very attractive in our models we're looking at. Sorry.
Yeah. No, I just in terms of first from a liability management. So liability management is you have too much debt that private credit can come in and be a solution provider, whether it's through offering to tender, through a subsidiary. So that's one way. As it applies to emerging markets, can help be a provider in situations where haven't gone according to plan. It's really innovative lending in which takes the form, being called private credit, but it's really innovative lending where you can protect yourself from the downside and participate in some of the upside. But I view it as more innovative in terms of terms that provide a good protection with the upside. Structured products haven't really been that evident or practiced that much in countries like Brazil, but there's no good reason why. So I could see private credit or credit solutions helping, innovate in countries such as that, which have pretty good scale, and there's no reason why, and pretty good consumer behavior for why that wouldn't be the case.
I'm going to go back to His Excellency's definition of private investment more broadly and say there's a lot of opportunity. Private credit, we've been mostly, I think, referencing corporate credit here, but the truth is it's a very wide category. And to Steve's term, innovation, it's very innovative these days. It includes novel ways to access real estate investments, infrastructure investments, which is particularly important, of course, to emerging markets. New ways to do asset lending. And in this way, again, private credit is moving away borrowers from traditional bank institutions and banking institutions. These thoughtful ways to deploy credit technology, if you want to call it that, can be utilized much more globally and give investors investment protection in places where they otherwise might not have been feeling so secure to lend to. And so I think these are actually helping to broaden out the scope and geography of private investment.
Can I cover just one very quickly? I think possibly just outside the norm here is the challenge that low-income countries face in terms of their debt sustainability. And if you take actually quite large number of these countries, they would be countries who actually have endowments and assets that they just need support to be able to monetize these assets over time. And helping them restructure that debt and under the common framework, obviously we need to work with the private side creditors to restructure, but then they also need the help of institutions like our friends here to provide them with the support in conjunction with multilateral development institutions to actually be able to weather the 3 or 5 or 6 years period that they need to develop their own endowments, industries, and whatever. I think there is a lot of room, a lot of opportunities that we can utilize private credit with multilateral institutions to help even in a more innovative way.
But it'll take a lot of engagement and mutual engagement between the private sector, the public sector, and the multilateral sector, right? Absolutely. Great conversation. Thank you, everybody. Thanks, for your thoughts. Really enjoyed it. And thank you to the audience for listening. Hope that you found it helpful.
Thank you.